The collar was already rising when Priya Ose stopped breathing. It hung above the verdict court on 4 threads of blue current, a ring of dark alloy no wider than a dinner plate, and it was descending toward the shoulders of a man in a gray consular coat who had, 6 weeks ago, taught her how to fold a formal apology into 40 words instead of 400. Ambassador Thaddeus Corr stood with his hands loose at his sides. Not bound, ratified petitioners were never bound. That was the one mercy the Calyx Dominion still extended to the condemned. And he was looking not at the collar, and not at High Adjudicator Thesson Ard reading the sentence from a data slate the size of a coffin lid, but out across the plaza, at the gallery where Priya stood pinned between 2 Dominion marshals who had orders not to let her closer than 30 meters. 63 worlds were watching. The span carried the feed to every screen in Dominion space that hadn't been physically switched off, and by the numbers scrolling along the base of the broadcast glyph, most of them hadn't bothered. Ard had wanted an audience. Ard had gotten one. For the unlawful killing of 11 registered petitioners of the Austrian delegation, Ard read, his voice pitched to carry, flattened by the translation lattice into something almost gentle, and for the death of Court Registrar Venik Thal, struck in the crossfire his own security detachment provoked, the accused, Thaddeus Corr, head of mission for the Saul Compact, stands condemned under Dominion Penal Code, Tribute Provision 9. Sentence: the collar. Executed now, before this court, that all who petition this throne understand what the Dominion's patience costs when it is spent. 6 weeks ago, there had been no crossfire. There had been 11 Austrian men and women who did not want to be there, marched to the gates of the threshold consulate with weapons they hadn't chosen and hadn't wanted, and a registrar with a recording lens who had been told to stand in exactly the spot where the story needed a body. Priya knew that because she had been 20 meters from the gate when it happened, closer than anyone else who was still alive to say so. She had told the tribunal, she had told anyone who would listen. It had not mattered, because the only people with the authority to override Ard's sentencing had already decided, weeks before the hearing began, that Earth's provisional status was inconvenient, and that the Corward Latch, the one stable transit corridor in this arm of the galaxy that ran within 4 light-years of Saul, was worth more than the truth. The collar reached Corr's shoulders. He did not flinch. In the last half-second before the current closed, he found Priya's eyes across 30 meters of Dominion marshals and cold plaza stone, and he did something she would spend the rest of her life trying to properly name. He almost smiled. Then the collar closed, and Ambassador Thaddeus Corr was dead before the sound of it reached the back rows of the gallery. For 1 full second, the verdict court was silent the way rooms are silent after something irreversible. Not shocked, not yet, just empty of the next thing to say. Ard lowered the data slate. Somewhere above, the span glyph held the frozen frame of the collar's discharge, ready to loop it for the 63 worlds still watching, the image that was supposed to be the last word on the matter. It was not the last word. The plaza's public screens, the ones ringing the verdict court, the ones the Dominion used to display sentencing text in 40 languages so no tribute world could claim ignorance of its own laws, went black for exactly 2 seconds. Then they lit again, all of them, all across 63 worlds at once, not with the loop of Corr's execution, but with a timestamp Priya recognized because she had watched Corr set it herself, 3 weeks before the trial even opened, in an office that smelled like recycled tea and old paper. Hearing Accord Remembrance Clause, RATIFIED Petitioner File 471 Earth, unsealed. Ard's head came up. For the first time since Priya had watched him prosecute a case designed from the first sentence to end exactly where it had just ended, High Adjudicator Thesson Ard looked like a man who had missed a step on a staircase he'd walked 1,000 times. "Cut the feed," he said, and it was the first thing all day he'd said that wasn't in his prepared script. Cut it. Cut the span feed now. Nobody cut it in time. On 63 worlds, in Dominion registry halls and Tribute World market squares, and the private quarters of officers who had never once questioned 3 centuries of institutional certainty, screens that had been showing a dead human ambassador, began, instead, to show the truth he had spent his last month alive making sure could never again be buried. Priya had not known, until that exact moment, what the small gray recording spindle in her coat pocket was for. She had carried it for 11 days because Kaur had pressed it into her hand and said, in the flat, unhurried voice he used for things that mattered too much for drama, "Don't open it. Don't ask what's on it. Just don't let it out of your sight until I tell you otherwise." He had never told her otherwise. He hadn't gotten the chance. She understood now that he never intended to. The spindle wasn't the trigger. He was. 6 weeks earlier, before any of it, before the gate, before Vivek Thal's body was found in the wrong position with the wrong angle of fire to match the story Ard wanted told, Thaddeus Kaur had spent an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon filing a routine amendment to Earth's provisional treaty status. Priya had drafted half the paperwork herself and thought nothing of it. Amendments were the water Kaur swam in, for a week, most of them boring enough to put a Dominion clerk to sleep. This one had reclassified Earth's head of mission, specifically and by name, from provisional envoy to ratified petitioner, a designation so old that most current Dominion jurists thought it was ceremonial, a fossil clause left over from the founding charter, 3 centuries dead in practice, because no ratified petitioner had been formally executed in living memory. The designation carried exactly one operative power. Under the remembrance clause of the hearing accord, the death sentence of a ratified petitioner, carried out by any Dominion authority, for any cause, automatically and irrevocably unsealed, that petitioner's entire case archived to every screen on the span, unedited, unredacted, the instant the sentence was executed. It had been written 300 years ago as the last check against a court that might kill a man to silence him. It assumed no adjudicator would be foolish enough, or arrogant enough, to use the collar on someone who held the status. Ard hadn't checked, or he had checked, and decided a fossil clause from a fossil charter wasn't worth the delay of confirming, because delay would have meant admitting, even privately, that he needed to be careful with a human. Kaur had known exactly what he was doing when he filed the amendment. He had known, 6 weeks later, exactly what he was doing when he stood under the collar and did not ask for clemency, did not argue procedure, did not do anything that might have given Ard a reason to postpone. He let the sentence happen because the sentence was the only door wide enough to carry the truth through, and he had spent the last month of his life making sure that when the door opened, there would be nothing behind it but fact. On the plaza screens, the unsealed file ran in real time. Security footage from the threshold consulate gate, not the version Ard's office had entered into evidence, cropped and slowed to make 11 unarmed petitioners look like a peaceful crowd cut down without cause, but the full feed, uncut, timestamped, showing the Austrian delegation arriving under armed escort that was not their own, showing weapons handed to them at the corner of the plaza by men in unmarked gray who were very clearly not Austrian, showing Registrar Vivek Thal positioned by one of those same men at an angle no consulate defender could have fired from, showing the first shot come from the crowd's side 4 full seconds before the threshold's perimeter guards returned fire at all. Then came the second file. Financial transfer logs, 3 of them, moving from an account registered to High Adjudicator Thesson Ard's own sector requisition office to a shell registry on the Austrian homeworld, dated 8 days before the ambush. Kaur had not obtained them through any channel Ard could later claim was fabricated by human hands. The transfers had been flagged, quietly, by a Dominion court registrar named Ilvek Sorn, whose job for 11 years had been auditing exactly this kind of requisition account, and who had never expected to find what she found. The third file was Kaur's own voice, recorded in his consular office 9 days before the trial began, addressed to no one in particular and everyone at once. Priya had not known it existed. She heard it now, standing in the gallery with the marshal's grip finally loosening on her arms as both of them turned, transfixed, toward the nearest screen. "If you are hearing this," Kaur's recorded voice said, steady, unhurried, the same voice he'd used to teach her how to write an apology in 40 words, "then the remembrance clause has done its work, and I am no longer able to say this in person, which I regret, because I would have liked to see Adjudicator Ard's face. I want to be plain about one thing. I did not seek my own death. I sought the only mechanism left to me that Adjudicator Ard could not quietly suppress, redact, or delay past the point where anyone still cared. 3 centuries ago, the architects of this dominion's own charter understood that a court willing to kill a petitioner to bury a case is a court that has already failed. They built a failsafe into their own law rather than trust that no future adjudicator would ever be that court. I did not write that clause. I only made sure it still worked." The recording paused, half a second, and when it continued, Kaur's voice had not changed register at all, which was, Priya would think later, the most frightening and the most core thing about the whole message. "To the Austrian delegation, whoever survives among you, you were used, and I am sorry for it, and Earth bears you no grievance for a crime committed against your own people before it was committed against mine. To the 63 worlds watching, nothing in this file requires you to trust me. It requires only that you watch it in full and decide for yourselves whether a dominion that manufactures a massacre to seize a transit corridor is the dominion your world signed their treaties with. And to Priya." Priya's chest went tight in a way that had nothing to do with the marshal's grip. "Finish the filing, you know how, I taught you on purpose." The recording ended. On 63 worlds, for one held breath, nothing moved. Then everything did. High Adjudicator Thesson Ard had built his career on the assumption that competence and certainty were the same thing, and for 11 years in the Core Ward Reach that assumption had never once been tested past its limit. He had prosecuted 41 tribute disputes and won all of them. He had overseen the Reach's transition from provisional oversight to full annexation on 6 separate worlds, without a single formal Dominion inquiry into his methods. He had identified, correctly, that the Core Ward Latch's stability made the Sol system's 4 light-year proximity worth more to Dominion logistics than the entire rest of humanity's provisional treaty combined, and he had built a case, patiently, over 11 months, that would let him take it. Every piece of that case had worked exactly as designed until the one variable he had dismissed as ceremonial trivia turned out to be load-bearing. He did not waste time on disbelief. That was, Priya would later admit, the single most competent thing she ever saw him do. Within 4 seconds of the recording ending, Ard was already moving, already shouting orders into a wrist comm that connected directly to Dominion span control, already doing the only thing left that might still save him: bury it faster than 63 worlds could absorb it. "Span control, this is High Adjudicator Ard, priority override. I want every relay in the Core Ward Reach dark in the next 90 seconds. Call it a network fault. Call it whatever you want. I want that file gone from every screen in this sector before one more world finishes watching it. Sir, the Remembrance Clause carries its own broadcast authority. It's not rooted through. I don't care what it's rooted through, cut it." They could not cut it, not in 90 seconds, not in 900. The clause had been built, deliberately, to root around exactly this kind of override, because the architects who wrote it 3 centuries ago had understood that the adjudicator most likely to want it silenced was also the adjudicator most likely to have the authority to try. But Ard did not know that yet with certainty, and a man with 11 months of careful work collapsing under him does not wait to find out. He turned from his wrist comm to the nearest marshal captain, a broad-shouldered Keithrai officer named Dasa Vren, who had commanded the verdict court's security detail for 6 years, and had never once had cause to doubt an order from the bench. "The consular aide," Ard said, nodding toward the gallery, toward Priya. "She has the original spindle. Kaur gave it to her, I want it, and I want her held for questioning on whether she assisted in the fabrication of evidence against this court." He did not stop there. In the same breath, before Vren had so much as turned to obey, Ard raised 2 fingers toward a second aide standing at the edge of the dais. A narrow, sharp-eyed Dominion staffer named Corey Basson, whose 6 years of service had consisted almost entirely of learning to anticipate the high adjudicator's next 4 sentences before he spoke the first one, and gave an order that had nothing to do with the plaza, or Priya, or the spindle at all. "Get me sector command, my authority code, not the court's, priority channel." Basson did not ask why. That was, Priya would understand much later, the specific quality Ard had always prized most in the people he kept closest to him. A willingness to relay an order at speed and reserve any question of its wisdom for some private hour that, in Basson's case, never quite arrived. Within 90 seconds, while Vren's grip was still finding Priya's arm, while the plaza's screens were still looping Kaur's last recorded words to 63 worlds who had not yet finished absorbing them, a Dominion strike wing designated 9th Escort, 6 vessels currently holding routine patrol along the Corward Reach's outer trade lanes, received new orders under Ard's personal seal. Proceed at best speed to the Corward Latch, and take up close escort position alongside the human contingency fleet already on station there, under the stated justification of securing Dominion shipping interests during what Ard's order termed, with the particular blandness of a man already rehearsing how the phrase would read in an inquiry transcript, a period of civil unrest in the sector capital. It was, on its surface, a defensible order. It was also, Priya would only understand in hindsight, the single most dangerous thing Ard did all day, more dangerous by an order of magnitude than anything he'd attempted in the verdict court, because a courtroom argument that failed cost him a case, and a fleet maneuver that failed at the Corward Latch could cost considerably more than that, to considerably more people than just him. Ard's reasoning, reconstructed weeks later from Sector Command's own logs by a convocation inquiry that took a great deal longer than the emergency session that ended his career, was not complicated. He could not unair the file. He could not, in the 90 seconds he'd had to think about it, credibly discredit Kaur's testimony, or Ilvex's logs, or an authentication chain Priya was still hours from establishing. But he could, if he moved fast enough, hand 63 worlds a second story to compete with the first one, and there was no faster way to make a galaxy forget a fabricated massacre than to manufacture a fresh one. 6 Dominion warships closing on a human contingency fleet that had just watched its ambassador executed on camera was not a request for calm. It was a lit fuse laid directly across the one contingency Corps' entire plan had never accounted for, because Kaur had spent 11 years building institutional safeguards against a court willing to kill a man to bury a case, and none at all against that same court, in its last hour of power, reaching for a war instead. Whether 9th Escort's wing commander understood exactly what she had been ordered to risk, no one would ever establish with certainty. What the logs showed was that she acknowledged the order within 11 seconds and altered course within 40, and that somewhere in the 4 hours between that acknowledgement and the moment the convocation's vote was finally gavelled final, 6 Dominion warships crossed 2/3 of the distance to the Corward Latch's outer marker, closing on Fleet Commodore Anwar Ray's and Herald's squadron at a velocity that any competent tactical officer, human or Dominion, would have read as considerably more than an escort. Vren's grip found Priya's arm again, harder this time, and for one disorienting second the whole plaza tilted around her, the black stone underfoot, the collar still hanging on its 4 threads above the empty space where Kaur had stood, the screens looping the unsealed file to 63 worlds that would never again quite believe the Dominion's word the way they had that morning. She thought with a clarity that surprised her that this was the part Core hadn't planned for. He had planned the trigger. He had not been able to plan what happened to the person left holding the spindle after it fired. "You don't want to do this," she said to Vren, not loudly, because loud never worked on Keithry and Core had taught her that too. "Everyone on this plaza is holding a device that recorded what just happened. If I disappear into a Coreward reach holding cell an hour after the man who exposed a fabricated massacre, that's not a footnote. That's the second file." Vren's grip did not loosen, but his eyes went, for half a second, to Ard, and Priya understood that even a marshal captain who had never doubted an order in 6 years was doing the arithmetic now, in real time, on which side of this particular morning was going to still have a career by evening. "Move her," Ard snapped, before Vren could finish the thought aloud. "Now, through the west corridor, not the public gate." They moved her. Priya did not fight it. Fighting would have cost her nothing but a bruise, and given Ard exactly the footage he needed to reframe the day. A human aide assaulting Dominion marshals, and she had learned enough from 11 weeks at Core's side to know that the correct move sometimes was to let the current carry you until you found better ground to stand on. What she did instead, as Vren and a second marshal walked her fast down the west corridor away from the plaza's public cameras, was reach into her coat pocket and close her hand around the spindle and begin, very quietly, counting exits. The west corridor of the verdict court ran 200 meters under Cesare Vanter's judicial quarter before it surfaced near the registry annex, a squat gray building where 3 centuries of Dominion case law were stored in physical archive as a backup against exactly the kind of catastrophic network failure Ard had just tried and failed to manufacture. Priya knew the route because Core had walked it with her a dozen times, always at the same unhurried pace, always narrating the building's history like a man who genuinely loved bureaucratic architecture, which she understood now, with the particular ache of grief that hadn't finished arriving yet. He had, because he had been quietly memorizing every choke point and side door in the judicial quarter for months, in case exactly this happened. Halfway down the corridor, the lights failed. Not a Dominion power fault. Those stuttered and flickered before they died. These went out clean, all at once, the whole corridor swallowed into a dark broken only by the faint blue emergency strip along the floor, and in the half-second of confusion that followed, Priya felt Vren's grip on her arm go slack as someone, moved through the dark with a speed that had clearly been planned rather than improvised. There was a sound like a held breath let out fast, a stumble, a low Keithry curse cut short, and then a hand that was not Vren's closed around Priya's wrist and pulled her sideways through a service door she hadn't even known was there. "Don't scream," said a voice in accented but perfectly clear trade standard. "I promise this looks worse than it is." The service door sealed behind them, and the emergency lighting inside, a narrow archive corridor lined with physical record cases, was just bright enough for Priya to make out the speaker. A Thren woman, tall and narrow-shouldered in a court registrar's gray sash, her four-fingered hand still shaking slightly from whatever had just happened to the marshals in the corridor behind them. "Ilvek Sorn," the woman said, before Priya could ask. "I flagged the transfer logs 11 months ago, and I have spent every day since wondering if I would live long enough to see anyone do anything with them. Ambassador Core found me 3 weeks ago. He said you would need somewhere to go the moment this happened, and he was, unfortunately, exactly right. The marshals are unconscious, not dead. I have colleagues here who owe me favors and don't ask questions, that's all. Don't look at me like I'm braver than I am." Ilvex was already moving, leading Priya deeper into the archive stacks, her pace quick and certain in a way that suggested she'd walked this route in her head a dozen times, the same way Core had walked the corridor above it. Ard cannot keep this contained, but he can make it messy, and messy works for him almost as well as contained. He will say the recording is fabricated. He will say I falsified the transfer logs. He will say you coerced Core into implicating himself to protect Earth's status, and half the Reach will want to believe him, because believing him is easier than admitting they've spent 3 centuries trusting a court that just executed a man to keep a corridor. The remembrance clause got the file onto every screen in the sector. It did not make anyone believe it. That's still your job. My job, Priya repeated, and heard, distantly, how strange the word sounded applied to her. 26 years old, 11 weeks into a posting she'd taken because Core had personally recruited her out of a treaty law program at the University of Nairobi, and told her, with the same flat certainty he'd used for everything, that she had better instincts for this work than she credited herself with. You have the original spindle, not a copy, the original, the one every forensic registrar in this sector will recognize as untampered the moment they run it, because it still carries the consular office's unbroken authentication chain. I have the transfer logs, sealed under my own registrar's bond, which means ARD cannot simply claim I fabricated them without also accusing the registry's own audit system of corruption, and he is not yet desperate enough to burn that bridge. Separately, either of us is a claim ARD can attack. Together, in front of the convocation, we are a case he cannot survive. The convocation doesn't sit for another, Priya started, and Ilvex was already shaking her head. It's sitting in 4 hours. 11 delegations invoked emergency session the moment the file hit their home screens, the Velithri, the Ostrin themselves, 3 Reach worlds who have spent a decade watching ARD's annexation pattern and wondering when their turn would come. He cannot stop the session. He can only try to make sure we never reach it to testify. Ilvex stopped at a service lift at the end of the stacks, keyed it open with a registrar's authority chit that Priya suspected wasn't strictly hers to use, and looked back with an expression that was, for the first time since they'd met, genuinely frightened rather than merely urgent. I need you to understand something before this door opens. ARD has already lost the file. He has not yet lost the war for what the file means. If he can kill this before the convocation, or discredit it, or simply keep us from arriving with both pieces of evidence intact, the story that survives isn't the truth. It's whichever version reaches 63 world screens last and loudest. That is the only fight left today, and it is not a small one. The lift doors opened onto a loading concourse 3 levels below the registry, wide and half-lit, stacked with cargo containers bound for worlds whose names Priya didn't recognize. And it was there, crossing open ground toward a transit tram platform on the concourse's far side, that ARD's people finally caught up to them. There were 4 of them, not marshals' plainclothes, moving with the loose economy of people who had done this kind of work before and didn't need a uniform to do it again. Ilvex saw them first and did not slow down, did not change her stride at all, which told Priya more about how seriously to take the situation than any shout would have. Cargo containers, Ilvex said, low and fast. Left row, 3rd stack, there's a maintenance gap between containers 4 and 5 wide enough to run through and too narrow for anyone bigger than us to follow fast. Go. They ran. Priya had played club sport at university and thought she was reasonably fit. She discovered, in the next 90 seconds, that a Thren registrar with 11 years of desk work behind her could still outpace a human in a flat sprint when the alternative was capture. And she pushed to keep up, boots hammering the concourse decking, the spindle clenched so hard in her fist that its casing bit into her palm. Behind them, one of ARD's people shouted something in Dominion standard too fast and too clipped for the translation lattice in her collar to catch cleanly. And then something struck the container beside her head, not a weapon discharge. She understood a half-second later, but a thrown restraint tether, meant to bind rather than kill, because whatever else ARD was willing to risk today. Killing a human aide and a Dominion registrar in front of a registry's own security cameras was apparently still a line even he hesitated to cross in daylight. The maintenance gap was exactly as narrow as Ilvex had promised. Priya turned sideways and shoved through it, felt the container's edge scrape her shoulder hard enough to leave a bruise she wouldn't notice until hours later, and came out the far side into a service alley that ran, mercifully, straight toward the tram platform. Ilvex was 3 steps ahead of her, and behind them the sound of pursuit had gone from 4 sets of footsteps to 2. 2 of Ard's people, apparently, had judged the gap not worth the delay and gone the long way around, buying precious seconds. The tram platform was not empty. A Dominion transit checkpoint had been stood up at its access gate sometime in the last hour. Not, Priya understood with a lurch, aimed at them specifically, but part of the general tightening of security across Cesare Vanter's judicial quarter that any assassination-adjacent morning produced. A young transit officer running standard identity scans on everyone passing through, bored and thorough in the specific way of someone who did not yet know what he might be looking for. Ilvex did not break stride, which Priya was learning, hour by hour, was the single most reliable thing about her. She walked directly toward the checkpoint rather than around it, pulling her registrar's sash straight with one hand as she went, and produced her credentials chit before the officer had finished glancing up. "Registrar Sorn, Reach Audit Division, Priority Transit Clearance," she said, in a voice that carried none of the last 10 minutes sprint in it. "This is a consular liaison under registry escort, urgent business, convocation adjacent. I don't have time to explain the nature of it, and you don't have the clearance to be told if I did." The officer's scanner caught Priya's identity chit, a consular aide's credential, still valid, still entirely legitimate and entirely useless if the officer thought to cross-reference it against whatever alert Ard's plainclothes people had, or hadn't, managed to file in the last hour, and held on the display a half-second longer than Priya's pulse could comfortably survive. "Consular liaison to Ambassador Corps' mission," the officer said slowly, reading it off the screen. "The one from this morning's." "Yes," Ilvex said, before he could finish the sentence, before the word execution or the word collar could land in the open air of a public platform and turn every head within earshot. "The one from this morning, which is precisely why registry priority applies, and precisely why I'd ask you not to make this the checkpoint that gets written up for delaying an active audit response during a convocation-adjacent emergency. Your captain's authorization code is on my chit's clearance tier. Check it, if you'd like. It will take you longer than we have." It was, Priya understood later, a very specific kind of bluff. Not a lie exactly, since everything Ilvex had said was technically true, but a wager that a young officer facing down a superior's clearance tier and a phrase like convocation-adjacent emergency would choose the path that couldn't get him blamed for anything, which was almost always the path of least resistance. He looked at the chit for one more second, glanced toward Priya with an expression she couldn't read, and waved them both through without checking the captain's code at all. They made the tram with 11 seconds to spare, according to the platform chronometer Priya would remember with strange precision for years afterward, and as the doors sealed and the car pulled away from the concourse, she finally let herself look down at her own hands, shaking now that there was nothing left to run from for the next 4 minutes, and understood with a lurch that the fight, as Ilvex had said, was not over. It had barely started. "Convocation Hall," Ilvex said, breathing hard but already composing herself, already pulling a compact registrar's data slate from her sash and beginning to draft something with quick, precise strokes. 4 hours. We need the spindle authenticated by a neutral forensic registrar before we walk in. If Ard's people reach us again before that happens, or if they reach the registry's forensic office first and pressure someone into declaring the chain of custody compromised, we lose the only advantage we have left. Is there someone you trust? There's someone who owes his career to my not reporting a filing error that would have ended it 11 years ago. I trust him exactly as much as that's worth, which today is more than I trust most of the registry." Ilvex looked up from the slate, and for a moment something older and more tired passed over her narrow face. Ambassador Kaur asked me a question 3 weeks ago when he first came to my office. He asked whether I thought the Dominion's own law, if forced to look directly at itself, was still capable of being ashamed. I told him I didn't know. I have spent 11 years watching this reaches court's rubber stamp, whatever the sector office wanted rubber stamped, and I did not think I had any faith left to give the question an honest answer. What did he say? He said that was fine. He said he wasn't asking me to have faith. He was asking me to help him build a case sturdy enough that faith wouldn't be required. Ilvex's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. I have been thinking about that answer for 3 weeks, and I still don't know if it's the most cynical thing anyone has ever said to me or the most hopeful, possibly both. The tram carried them across 2 more transit junctions, and twice Priya watched Ilvex tense at the sight of Dominion Marshal patrols on connecting platforms, and twice the patrols passed without incident, because Priya realized only later Ard's official channels still did not know to look for them yet. His plainclothes people knew. His marshals did not yet, because putting out a formal alert for a Dominion court registrar and a human consular aide, an hour after a broadcast accusing him of manufacturing a massacre, would have meant explaining to every marshal captain in the Reach exactly why he wanted them, and Ard could not yet afford that particular conversation to happen out loud. It was on the second junction platform, waiting for the connecting tram, that Priya first saw the numbers. They were scrolling along a public information board meant for transit schedules, repurposed, she realized after a second, by someone in the registry's own network division who had decided that today, of all days, the schedule board could carry something more useful. Real-time engagement figures from the span broken down by world. How many households on each of the 63 broadcasting worlds had watched the unsealed file in full? The Austrian homeworld, 81%. The Vela 3 colonies, 74%. 3 Reach worlds Ard had personally overseen the annexation of within the last decade, 60, 71, 68. Even on Cesare Vanter itself, the judicial hub, seat of the verdict court, 59% of registered households had now watched Ard's own transfer logs implicate him in the deaths of 11 of his own tribute world's petitioners. He's losing them, Priya said, half to herself. He's losing the ones who were already tired of him, Ilvex said, watching the numbers with an expression Priya couldn't read. That's not the same as losing the convocation. The delegations that matter today aren't households. They're 63 seated representatives who have spent decades building careers on the assumption that the Dominion's courts, whatever their flaws, do not simply manufacture evidence to seize territory. If they accept that assumption is false, they have to ask what else it's been false about, on worlds far from any span camera, for far longer than 6 weeks. That is a much more expensive thing for most of them to admit than it is for a household to change the channel. 4 hours, Priya thought, watching the tram doors open, and did the math without meaning to. 2 hours and 40 minutes left, and the man who had built the case that mattered most was not going to be in the room to make it. The forensic registrar Ilvex trusted, a soft-spoken, heavily built Dominion-born man named Petrus Call, whose office in the lower registry smelled of ozone and cataloging wax, took 11 minutes to run the spindle's authentication chain, 11 minutes during which Priya sat very still in a plastic chair designed for a physiology that wasn't quite human and tried not to watch the door. When Call finally looked up from his instruments, his broad face had the particular stillness of a man delivering news he already knew was going to matter. "Unbroken," he said. "Consular office seal, intact from the moment of recording. Whoever tries to claim this was fabricated after the fact will have to also claim the entire threshold consulate's authentication infrastructure was compromised 11 days before the trial even opened, which is a claim that opens roughly 40 other questions adjudicator Ard will not want asked." He hesitated, then added more quietly, I met the ambassador twice. Filing disputes, nothing important. He remembered my name both times, which is more than I can say for most of the Dominion officials I process paperwork for. I'm sorry for what happened to him today. Thank you, Priya said, and found that the words came out steadier than she felt. I'll file the authentication under my own registrar's seal, which means it travels with the same institutional weight as Registrar Sorn's transfer logs. ARD cannot dismiss either without formally accusing the registry itself of corruption, and that is a fight he does not currently have the standing to pick. Call handed the spindle back to Priya with something that looked, for a Dominion bureaucrat, almost like reverence. The convocation convenes in 90 minutes. I would not linger in this building. ARD's people know where the forensic office is, and there are at least 2 paths to Convocation Hall from here that don't run past a single registry checkpoint he controls. They took one of those paths, and it was on that path, in the last stretch before Convocation Hall's outer plaza, that the cost Ilvex had warned her about finally arrived. They came out of a registry side entrance onto a narrow processional avenue lined with the flags of Tribute Worlds, 63 of them. Priya would count later, though she didn't count them now, and ARD's plainclothes people were waiting, not 4 this time but 6, spread wide enough across the avenue's width that there was no gap narrow enough to run through. Ilvex stopped so fast Priya nearly ran into her. There's a service stair behind the 4th flagpole, Ilvex said, very quietly, very fast. It surfaces inside Convocation Hall's East Gallery past their perimeter. Go, now, while I still have their attention. Ilvex. I filed the transfer logs 11 months ago because it was the right thing to do, and I have spent every day since being quietly ashamed that I never expected to be asked to do more than file them. Ilvex's 4-fingered hand closed briefly, hard, around Priya's wrist, not pulling her forward this time, but holding her still for 1/2 second of absolute clarity. Core built this so that it did not depend on any one person surviving to finish it. That includes me. Go. Priya went, because there wasn't time to argue, and because some cold, clear part of her understood that arguing was exactly what Ilvex didn't have time for either. She reached the 4th flagpole, found the service stair exactly where Ilvex had said it would be, and heard, as the stairwell door sealed behind her, the sound of ARD's people closing on the registrar she'd left standing alone in the avenue. Not a weapon discharge this time either, but the flat impact of a restraint tether finding its mark, and a single sharp cry that Priya would hear again, unbidden, for a long time after that day. She did not stop. She climbed, 3 steps at a time, spindle in one fist and Call's sealed authentication chit in the other, and came up through a maintenance hatch into the East Gallery of Convocation Hall with 4 minutes to spare before the emergency session was gavelled into order, her shoulder bleeding through her coat where the cargo container had caught it hours before, her breath tearing, and no registrar beside her to corroborate the second half of the case. The convocation of the Calyx throne did not sit often, and when it did, it sat in a chamber built for exactly this kind of moment. A wide amphitheater ring beneath a domed ceiling that had once, 3 centuries ago, been designed to let sunlight from Cesare Vanter's own star fall directly onto the speaker's floor. A piece of architectural theater meant to remind every delegate that they sat, quite literally, in the light. 63 delegation seats ringed the chamber. 58 of them were occupied. 5 worlds, Priya would learn later, had held their seats empty in protest, unwilling even to appear to legitimize a session called under such conditions. And at the center of the floor, beneath the light, stood High Adjudicator Thesson Ard, still in the formal robes he'd worn to pronounce sentence that morning, addressing the assembled delegations with the particular calm of a man who had decided his only remaining strategy was total, unshaken confidence. And I would remind this convocation, Ard was saying, as Priya slipped through a service door into the gallery's lower tier, drawing exactly the kind of attention a bleeding, breathless human stranger draws in a chamber full of alien dignitaries, that the remembrance clause, however dramatic its presentation, unseals a case file. It does not authenticate it. What 63 Worlds watched this morning was footage and financial records that the accused's own office had every opportunity, every motive, and every technical capacity to fabricate in advance, knowing the clause would guarantee it an audience no honest defense could ever purchase. Ambassador Kaur did not die because he was innocent. He died because he understood that a manufactured martyrdom, broadcast at the moment of his own execution, was the single most effective weapon his species had left. I ask this convocation not to be so grieved by a clever man's final theater that it forgets to ask the only question that matters. Where is the independent corroboration? Where is a single piece of evidence in that file that did not pass, at some point, through human hands? It was, Priya understood even as her pulse hammered in her ears, a genuinely good argument, built by a man who had clearly spent the last 4 hours doing nothing but sharpening it. And she watched 3 delegations along the amphitheater's near curve nodding slowly, visibly, weighing his words with the particular caution of people who had built careers on not being fooled twice. She stepped out of the gallery's shadow and into the light. "There is," she said, and her voice, cracked with running and grief and 4 hours of adrenaline, carried further in that dome than she expected it to. "My name is Priya Osai. I was Ambassador Kaur's protocol and legal aid. I hold the original recording spindle from the threshold consulate gate, authenticated 90 minutes ago under the sealed chit of Dominion Forensic Registrar Petrus Call, whose authentication I would ask this convocation to summon and verify directly rather than take on my word. And the financial transfer logs adjudicator Ard just characterized as fabricated were not filed by a human hand at all. They were filed 11 months ago, 11 months, before any of this began, by a Dominion Court registrar named Ilvek Sorn, under her own registrar's bond, in the ordinary course of an audit that had nothing to do with Earth. The Chamber's attention, which had been Ard's alone a moment before, turned entirely to her, and Priya felt the full physical weight of 58 delegations looking at once, and made herself keep speaking before the fear could catch up to the words. Registrar Sorn should be standing beside me right now corroborating that under her own seal. She isn't, because 6 minutes ago, on the processional avenue outside this hall, she was taken by 6 of adjudicator Ard's people so that I could reach this chamber in time to speak. I would ask this convocation to consider what it means that a Dominion Court registrar, doing nothing more than her own sworn duty, is currently in restraint custody for the crime of having found the truth 11 months before anyone was ready to hear it. Ard's composure did not break. Priya would give him that later, in the strange, fair-minded way grief sometimes allows, but something in his jaw tightened, the first visible crack in 4 hours of unshaken confidence. "I have no knowledge of any registrar being detained," he said, and it might even have been true in the narrowest technical sense, an order given once, hours ago, its consequences unfolding now outside his direct sight. "Then I'd ask this convocation to order her released and brought before it immediately," said a new voice, from the delegation ring's far curve, "so that adjudicator Ard's ignorance can be either confirmed or corrected on the record." The speaker was an elder Velithri delegate, silver-scaled, seated in the row reserved for worlds that had petitioned for expanded autonomy within the last decade and been quietly, procedurally denied. One of the 11 delegations that had forced this emergency session in the first place. 2 more delegates seconded the motion before the Chamber's presiding officer, a spare, unreadable Dominion magistrate named Corvin Ith, who had sat through the entire proceeding without visibly favoring either side, had finished formally acknowledging it. It took 19 minutes. Priya would not learn what those 19 minutes had cost until much later, when Ilvex herself, in the flat, unhurried voice she used for facts too large to soften, told her what had happened on the processional avenue after the service stair door sealed. ARD 6 operatives had not taken Ilvex to a registry holding cell, where a convocation order could reach her within minutes, and a duty log would record exactly who had ordered her held and why. They had taken her instead to an unmarked security office 3 levels below the avenue, a windowless room meant for processing minor tribute world infractions, the kind of space with no camera feed rooted anywhere a magistrate's clerk might think to look for one. A Dominion interrogator Ilvex did not recognize, mid-ranked, unhurried, the specific calm of someone who had done this exact job for exactly this kind of person many times before, and expected this time to be no different, sat across a bare table from her, and did not raise his voice once. "You understand," he said, in the same register he might have used to discuss a filing deadline, "that the finding you are about to be asked to disavow was never yours to make. Audit flags are preliminary. They are not conclusions. No registrar in the history of the Corward Reach has ever been prosecuted for retracting a preliminary flag once its broader implications became clear. I am offering you the easiest version of the rest of your career, Registrar Sorn. I would encourage you to take it." "The filing is time-stamped," Ilvex said. 11 months old. You cannot retroactively make it preliminary. You can only make me lie about what it already says. I can make it disappear from the record entirely if it comes to that. I would rather not. I am not an unreasonable man." He set a data slate on the table between them, already populated with a retraction statement in her own registrar's formatting, waiting only for her authentication mark. "Sign this, and you go home tonight to a career that continues exactly as it was yesterday. Don't, and I cannot promise what happens to a registrar who has just materially assisted in what my superiors are already calling an act of evidentiary sabotage against a sitting high adjudicator." Ilvex did not reach for the slate. She would tell Priya, weeks later, that the thing that steadied her in that room was not courage exactly. She was careful to correct anyone who used that word about her, but arithmetic of a kind, she'd spent 11 years training herself to trust over fear. The filing existed in registry archive independent of anything she said in this room, and a retraction extracted under restraint, the moment anyone thought to check the timestamp against the record of her own detention, would read as exactly what it was. The interrogator was offering her a rope with the other end, already tied to a stone. "No," she said. He did not react with anger, which she found afterward more unsettling than if he had. He simply nodded, once, as though she'd confirmed something he'd already privately assumed, left the retraction slate on the table between them, unsigned, and told the 2 guards outside the door to hold her until further instruction. Instruction that never came, because 17 minutes into the 19, the convocation would spend debating whether to summon her. Magistrate Ives' own directive reached the security office's duty desk with a formal seal that neither guard was willing to weigh against an informal order from a high adjudicator whose authority, they had both just watched broadcast to 63 worlds, was no longer entirely certain to survive the afternoon. They released her without another word. She walked out of the unmarked office with a bruise blooming along one cheekbone from when she'd been taken on the avenue, a restraint mark still raw at her wrist, and no idea, until the 2 convocation marshals met her at the building's entrance, that Priya had already reached the chamber, already spoken, already put both their names and both their evidence on the record in front of 58 delegations, before anyone had confirmed whether Ilvex herself would ever get the chance. Priya stood in the light the whole time, spindle in one hand, Call's authentication chit in the other, and did not sit when offered a chair, because some part of her understood that sitting, right now, would read as relief she hadn't yet earned. When the chamber's outer doors finally opened, and 2 convocation-appointed marshals, not ARD's people, summoned instead by Magistrate Ives' own direct order, a small but unmistakable signal of which way institutional weight was beginning to shift, brought Ilvex Sorn into the chamber, bruised along one side of her narrow face, a restraint mark still visible at her wrist. Priya felt something in her chest that she would later recognize as the first moment, since the collar closed, that she'd allowed herself to feel anything at all beyond forward motion. Ilvex did not need to be prompted. She walked, unsteady but upright, to stand beside Priya beneath the dome's light, and addressed the convocation in the flat, precise cadence of 11 years spent writing findings that had to survive scrutiny. I am Registrar Ilvex Sorn, Corward Reach Registry, Audit Division, 11-year service, no prior disciplinary finding. 11 months ago, in the ordinary course of a routine requisition audit, I flagged 3 financial transfers moving from High Adjudicator Ard Sector Requisition Office to a Shell Registry account on the Austrian homeworld. Each transfer dated in the 8 days preceding the incident at the threshold consulate gate. I filed that finding under my own registrar's bond, through the standard audit channel, 11 months before the ambassador's trial began and long before any human being knew my name. I would ask this convocation to pull the original filing timestamp directly from Registry Archive, independent of anything I say today, because I understand precisely how much weight my own testimony now carries against the word of a high adjudicator, and I would rather this convocation trust its own records than trust me. Magistrate Ive, for the first time in the entire session, spoke without being prompted by a delegation's motion. "Pull it," he said to a clerk at the chamber's lower tier, and the words landed in the amphitheater with a weight that made Ard, standing alone now in the center of the floor, go very still. The timestamp came back in under 3 minutes, projected onto the dome itself for all 63 delegations to see at once. A filing date 11 months old, a registrar's bond seal that predated by nearly a year anything Ard could plausibly claim had been coordinated with a human ambassador who had, at the time of the filing, not yet held the ratified petitioner status that made today's remembrance clause trigger possible at all. It was, Priya understood, watching 58 delegations absorb the timeline in real time, the single piece of evidence that no theory of human fabrication could survive, because it existed before the fabrication would have had any reason to begin. Ard was not finished. Priya understood that with a sinking clarity a moment before he confirmed it, watching him turn from the Velethri delegate's skepticism toward the chamber's outer doors with the particular composure of a man who has been holding one more card in reserve and has simply decided, watching his other arguments fail one by one, that it is finally time to play it. "This convocation has heard a great deal today about documents," Ard said, "timestamps, seals, chains of custody. The language of a court that has forgotten documents are not witnesses. They cannot be questioned. They cannot be pressed on what they saw and did not see. I would ask this convocation's indulgence for 5 more minutes, to hear instead from someone who was there, at the threshold consulate gate, 6 weeks ago. Someone who has waited 6 weeks for exactly this chance to speak, and been denied it, by a tribunal too eager to believe a dead man's final theater to ask what the living survivors of that morning actually saw." The chamber's outer doors opened, and 2 Dominion attendants brought forward an Austrian man Priya had never seen before, thin, travel-worn, dressed in the plain clothes of someone who had come a long way on short notice, his four-fingered hands folded with the careful stillness of a person who had rehearsed exactly how to hold them before an audience. He gave his name as Sen Okal, and said, in a voice that did not waver, that he had stood at the edge of the threshold consulate gate 6 weeks ago, close enough to see everything the convocation had just watched on the unsealed file, and that what the file showed was not, in the particular that mattered most, the truth. "The weapons were not handed to my delegation by strangers in unmarked gray," Okal said. "They were smuggled to us 3 days before, by agents working for the human consulate itself, on instruction we were told came directly from Ambassador Corps. We were told it was a demonstration, A show of grievance that would embarrass the Dominion into concessions Earth could not win through petition alone. We did not know, until the shooting started, that the demonstration was never meant to end without bodies in it. I lost my brother at that gate. I have spent 6 weeks watching the Dominion take the blame for a massacre a human ambassador built with his own hands, and I could not make anyone with the authority to matter listen to me, until an hour ago, when Adjudicator Ard's office finally returned my call. The chamber went very still. Priya felt the stillness the way she'd felt Vren's grip that morning, a physical pressure settling over the room, and understood, watching 3 delegations along the amphitheater's near curve exchange glances she recognized from 6 hours of watching Ard work, that this was exactly the kind of doubt he needed, not proof, not even close to proof, but enough uncertainty to give worlds already inclined to distrust a manufactured martyrdom the permission to keep distrusting it a little longer. That is not what happened, Priya said, and heard her own voice come out rougher than she wanted it to, because grief and 4 hours of adrenaline were a poor combination for composure. I was 20 meters from that gate. I watched the footage from the consular office's own unedited feed before any of this began, months before Ambassador Kaur filed a single amendment to his own status. I don't know who this man is. I don't know what he's been told or paid or threatened with, but I know he was not on any Austrian delegation manifest I ever saw, and I saw all of them, because managing delegation logistics was half my job for 11 weeks. A convenient claim from a woman with every reason to protect her own ambassador's memory, Ard said, against a survivor with every reason to want the truth told, now that the man who used him is beyond consequence. It was, Priya understood, a genuinely dangerous moment, not because Okel's story was good, but because it did not need to be good. It needed only to exist, loudly enough and publicly enough, to give 58 delegations a reason to defer judgment past the point where deferral would matter, and she felt the specific, cold panic of realizing that the only tool she had to fight it, her own certainty, was, in the chamber's eyes, exactly as unverifiable as Ard's witness. It was Petra's call, of all people, standing quietly at the gallery's edge where he'd arrived 20 minutes earlier to corroborate his own authentication findings if the convocation required it, who spoke next. And Priya would think afterward that it was the single bravest thing she saw a Dominion official do all day. Because unlike Ilvex, unlike Call's own forensic seal on the spindle, he had absolutely nothing compelling him to volunteer what he said. Magistrate Ive, Call said, before this convocation weighs that testimony, I would ask that it pull one more record, not from the human file, from the registry's own transit authority. Every individual entering Cesare Vanter's judicial quarter through official channels is issued an identity chit at first arrival, time-stamped and logged, regardless of species or origin. I would ask this witness's chit be checked. Ard's jaw did the thing Priya had seen it do once already that day, in the verdict court, the very first crack in 4 hours of unshaken confidence. This is an unnecessary delay of a witness who came forward voluntarily. Then the delay will cost him nothing, Magistrate Ive said, and nodded to the same clerk who had pulled Ilvex's filing timestamp less than an hour before. Pull it. It took less than 90 seconds. The record appeared on the dome alongside the earlier timeline, and it showed, in the same flat administrative certainty that had already undone one of Ard's arguments that day, that Sen Okel's identity chit had not been issued 6 weeks ago, or 6 days ago, or at any point before that morning. It had been issued 4 hours earlier, under a travel authorization requisitioned through High Adjudicator Ard's own sector office, less than 30 minutes after the collar closed on Ambassador Kaur. The chamber did not erupt. It did something quieter and, Priya thought, considerably worse for Ard. 58 delegations that had spent the last several minutes genuinely weighing a grieving brother's testimony against a dead man's recorded word, watched the actual provenance of that testimony resolve in front of them, in real time, and she saw the specific expression settle over delegate after delegate that she would come to recognize, over the following weeks, as the particular fury of people who have just discovered they were nearly made complicit in a lie. Okel did not wait to be questioned further. He was gone from the chamber floor within a minute, hustled out by the same two attendants who had brought him in, and Priya understood, though she would never learn it confirmed, one way or another, in any record she was permitted to see, that whatever had been promised to him or threatened against him, to bring him to that chamber, it had not included an expectation of being asked to survive cross-examination. Ard tried for another 11 minutes to hold his ground, pointing out, not unreasonably, that a flagged transfer wasn't proof of intent, that shell accounts existed for a dozen legitimate reasons, that correlation between a routine audit finding and a later incident was not the same as causation. It was, Priya thought, watching him, the performance of a genuinely capable man refusing to accept that competence alone wasn't going to save him this time, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost like grief for a stranger, that some part of Ard actually believed what he was arguing, the way a man convinced of his own indispensability can believe almost anything that keeps the belief intact. It ended, in the way these things sometimes do, on a single question from the Velithri delegate who had first moved to summon Ilvex. Not a legal question, not a procedural one, but the kind of plain question that cuts through 11 minutes of careful argument, because it doesn't engage with any of it. Adjudicator Ard, the delegate said, if none of this is what it appears to be, if the transfers are innocent, if the footage is misleading, if the ambassador engineered his own death purely for theater, then answer this convocation one thing plainly. Why, in the 90 seconds after the remembrance clause triggered, was your first order to span control an attempt to cut the broadcast, rather than a request to let it play in full and be judged on its merits by the world's watching? An innocent man does not reach first for the switch. Ard did not answer. Not because he had no answer prepared, Priya thought, but because every answer he could construct in the silence that followed would have sounded, to 58 delegations who had just watched a Dominion registrar's 11-month-old, independently time-stamped filing a line perfectly with a human ambassador's final testimony, exactly like what it was. Magistrate Ith let the silence hold for a long 5 seconds before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice carried the particular flatness of a man reading a verdict he had already, privately, reached some time before. This convocation finds, on the record now before it, sufficient cause to refer High Adjudicator Thesson Ard to full Dominion Tribunal on charges of judicial fabrication, unlawful procurement of a ratified petitioner's execution under false pretense, and conspiracy in the deaths of 11 Austrian nationals and 1 Dominion registrar. Pending that tribunal, his authority over the Corward Reach sector is suspended, effective immediately, and command of the sector reverts to interim Dominion oversight. Ith paused and turned, for the first time, directly toward Priya and Ilvex, still standing together in the center's cold light. This convocation further finds that the annexation claim advanced against the Saul Compact's provisional territory, specifically, jurisdiction over the Corward Latch Transit Corridor, was procured through the unlawful execution of a ratified petitioner, and is, under the hearing accord's own restitution provision, void from the moment of its attempted enforcement. Saul's provisional status is not merely restored. This convocation moves, and I will personally second, that it be elevated, effective today, on this record, under these witnessed circumstances, to full ratified sovereignty. No tribute-adjacent world has held that designation in 140 years. I can think of no world that has more plainly earned it in less time. The vote, when it came, was not close. 51 delegations in favor, 4 abstaining, 3 opposed for reasons that had more to do with old grievances against expanding any tribute world status than any doubt about the facts just laid bare. Priya heard the number announced and felt nothing that resembled triumph, only a bone-deep exhaustion, and underneath it, the specific, unbearable absence of the one person who should have been standing in the light to hear it. Before the chamber emptied, an elder Austrian delegate Priya had not heard speak all session. Seated, she would learn, as the formal head of the Austrian homeworld's own delegation, a position Sen Okal had never held or claimed to hold, crossed the chamber floor to where she stood, still bleeding faintly through her coat, still holding a spindle that had nothing left to prove. The delegate did not offer condolences, or gratitude, or any of the things Priya had braced herself to hear, and not know how to answer. "That man," the delegate said, with a small, precise nod toward the door Okal had been hustled through, "was not sent by us, and was not welcomed by us, and I would ask that this convocation's record reflect that the Austrian people bear no part in what he said today, any more than we bore any part in what was done to our own dead at that gate. We lost 11 of our own to a scheme built to use our grief as a weapon against a species that owed us nothing and gave us, in the end, the only honest accounting of that morning anyone has offered us at all." The delegate's gaze moved, briefly, to the empty space at the center of the chamber floor where Ard had stood. "I do not know what your ambassador believed about us in the end. I know what he did for us, which is a rarer thing to be certain of." Priya did not trust herself to answer that with anything more than a nod, and the delegate did not seem to expect more, and withdrew back toward the Austrian seats with the same unhurried formality with which she'd crossed the floor, leaving Priya and Ilvex alone in the last of the chamber's thinning crowd, both of them, for the first time in 11 hours, with nowhere left to run to and nothing left to prove before the room emptied around them. "You should sit down," Ilvex said. "You've been standing since the collar closed." "So have you." "I had less far to fall." Ilvex's mouth did the thing that wasn't quite a smile, the same one Priya had seen in the tram hours earlier, and for a moment neither of them said anything else, because there was, finally, nothing urgent left that needed saying. Word had reached the edge of the Sol system 3 hours earlier, relayed through the same emergency channels that had carried news of Kor's execution, and by the time the convocation's vote was gavelled final, Fleet Commodore Anwar Reyes had already held his ships at the Corward Latch's outer marker for 2 hours and 40 minutes, exactly as the Standing Contingency Corps had negotiated 11 years earlier specified. Visible, present, armed, and absolutely, deliberately still. The contingency had one operative clause, written by a much younger Corps during Earth's very first provisional treaty negotiation, back when nobody in the Dominion had taken the clause seriously enough to argue against it, that in the event of a ratified petitioner's unlawful death, Earth's contingency fleet would hold position at the nearest strategic corridor for no less than 6 hours, and no more than 12, present but non-engaging. A visible reminder that Earth's restraint was a choice, and not an absence of capacity. Reyes had not expected the hold to be tested. He had expected and privately hoped that the 6-hour minimum would pass in the specific, grinding tedium of armed men doing nothing while a political process light years away decided a war's worth of consequences without them. What he had not expected, 90 minutes into the hold, was the sensor contact. 6 signatures, Commodore, Dominion configuration, closing from bearing 114. Herald Squadron's tactical officer read the contact offer display with the flat calm of someone trained for exactly this moment and hoping, until the last possible second, not to need the training. "Closing velocity is high, sir. Higher than a standard patrol approach. If I had to characterize it, I'd call it an intercept profile, not an escort." Reyes had spent 11 years, on and off, in rooms with Thaddeus Corps, listening to a diplomat explain, patiently and at length, exactly why a fleet commander's instincts were the single most dangerous asset in a first contact-adjacent theater, because instincts were built for fights and this was not, whatever it looked like on a tactical display, supposed to be a fight. He held that lesson now with both hands. "Confirm weapons status," he said. "Ours stay cold. I want shields at standard alert, not combat posture. There's a difference, and I want every ship in this formation to know I know the difference. Broadcast standard approach protocol on open channel, all Dominion frequencies. Let's find out what they say they're doing before we decide what we think they're doing." What 9th Escort's wing commander said, when Herald Squadron's hail reached her, was almost exactly what Ard's order had specified. A routine security escort, nothing more, Dominion shipping interests, civil unrest in the sector capital, standard language delivered in a voice that Reyes' communications officer would later describe as sounding like someone reading a script she had not personally written and was not entirely comfortable reading. 6 Dominion warships did not, in Reyes' 11 years of experience, close on a foreign contingency fleet at intercept velocity to escort cargo lanes that were, as it happened, 4 light years from the nearest cargo lane worth escorting. The 6 vessels closed to 800 kilometers before they slowed, close enough, on a tactical display built for interstellar distances, to look less like an approach and more like a wall going up. Reyes' bridge went very quiet in the specific way bridges go quiet when every person on them is doing the same arithmetic, and none of them likes the answer. Somewhere behind him, he heard the particular intake of breath from a junior officer whose hand had drifted, entirely without conscious decision, toward a console she had no orders to touch. "Belay that," Reyes said without turning around, and did not raise his voice because raising his voice was, he had learned from watching Corps negotiate for a decade, the first thing a room did when it had already decided to be afraid, and fear was not a decision he was willing to let his bridge make for him. "Every ship, hold position, hold fire. I don't care what they do in the next 30 seconds that isn't an actual weapons discharge. We are not the ones who fire first today. We were not the ones who fired first this morning. And Ambassador Corps did not spend the last month of his life proving that on camera so that we could undo it 800 kilometers from a marker with nobody watching. Nobody fired. The 800 kilometers held, tense and unmoving, for the better part of an hour. 9th Escort's wing commander apparently as reluctant to be the one who escalated an already volatile diplomatic catastrophe as Reyes was. Both formations sitting in the particular standoff that exists specifically, because neither side wants to be the name attached to what happens next. And it was only when word of the convocation's ruling reached 9th Escort's own communications officer, relayed through Sector Command's general channel rather than any order from Ard, who by then had far larger problems than a fleet posture he'd ordered and could no longer justify, that the 6 Dominion ships began, without further explanation, to withdraw. Reyes watched them go, and said nothing to his bridge crew beyond confirming the withdrawal on the log, because the contingency corps had built specified a minimum hold regardless of provocation, and there were still hours left on the clock whether or not anyone had actually needed to fire a shot to prove it. Reyes had wanted, 4 hours into the hold, to move his ships closer. His standing orders, filed by Corps himself and countersigned by Earth's own compact council long before this morning, forbade it in language specific enough that even a Commodore furious at the death of a man he'd known for a decade could not find a loophole to justify disobeying it. When the news of the convocation's ruling reached Herald Squadron's flag bridge, Reyes held position for 11 more minutes before he gave the order to stand down and turn for home, and the only thing he said to his bridge crew, according to the log that Priya would read weeks later, was, "He built it so we wouldn't have to fire a shot. Let's not be the ones who ruin that." Priya did not see the fleet stand down. She was, at that moment, sitting in a registry medical bay having the cut on her shoulder sealed, Ilvex beside her with a cold compress against her bruised cheek, the two of them saying almost nothing to each other because there was, for the first time in 11 hours, nothing urgent left to say. It was Call, of all people, who brought her the news, appearing in the medical bay's doorway with the particular awkwardness of a bureaucrat trying to deliver something that mattered without sounding, as though he understood how much it mattered. "Your fleet held the marker for 2 hours and 40 minutes, he said. Then they turned around. "They didn't move closer," Priya said. "It wasn't quite a question." "No," Call said. "Not once the whole time. I checked the Reach's own sensor logs myself out of I don't know. Curiosity, I suppose, about what a species does with the room to escalate when it's just watched one of its own executed on camera." He hesitated, and something in his broad, careful face shifted into an expression Priya hadn't seen from a Dominion official before, not quite admiration, something closer to unsettled respect. "In 11 years auditing this Reach's sector conflicts, I have never once seen a contingency force hold a marker for that long without moving. Most species close the gap. Yours held it. I don't fully understand why that troubles me more than if you had closed it, but it does." "He didn't build a threat," Priya said, and found, as she said it, that she finally understood the shape of the last 11 weeks well enough to put it into a single sentence. "He built proof that we didn't need one." The formal ceremony elevating Saul's status came 3 days later, in the same convocation chamber, under the same dome, though the light through it had shifted with Cesare Vanter's slow seasonal turn into something paler and more autumnal than the hard morning brightness that had fallen on Corps' execution. Priya stood in the delegation seat that had, until 72 hours ago, been marked Provisional Saul Compact, and now read, in the Dominion's formal glyph script beneath a freshly mounted placard, Ratified Sovereign Saul Compact. And she was aware, distantly, of Ilvex standing 2 rows back in the registrar's gallery, her bruises faded to yellow-green, her presence there entirely unofficial and entirely, deliberately allowed by a registry that had suddenly discovered a great deal of institutional gratitude toward the woman who'd flagged an inconvenient audit, finding 11 months before anyone wanted to hear it. There was no grand address. Priya had half expected one, some sweeping Dominion pronouncement about lessons learned, the kind of speech that made for good span footage and worse honesty. But Magistrate Ith kept the formal proceeding short, procedural, almost deliberately unremarkable, and she understood, watching him, that this was its own kind of respect, treating Earth's new status as a fact of record rather than a story to be dramatized, the exact opposite of the spectacle Ard had built the verdict court to be. Afterward, in the quiet that followed the last delegation's formal acknowledgement, she walked alone to the threshold consulate, hers now, in the strange, hollow way that titles transfer to whoever is left standing, and found, in the office that still smelled faintly of recycled tea and old paper, a single sealed envelope on the desk where Corps had always left the day's most important business, the one place he'd trained her, without ever quite saying so, to look first. Inside was a single sheet, handwritten, dated the morning of the trial. "Priya, if you're reading this, the filing worked, and I am sorry for the manner in which it worked, because you deserved a mentor who taught you the job for longer than 11 weeks, and instead you got one who spent most of that time teaching you how to survive without him. I want to be honest about something I never said aloud, because saying it aloud would have made Ard suspicious of exactly the wrong thing at exactly the wrong moment. I did not choose this because I was certain it would work. 3 centuries is a long time for a clause to sleep. I could not know, filing that amendment 6 weeks ago, whether the Dominion's own institutions still had enough shame left in them to be moved by the truth once it reached them, or whether 63 worlds would watch the file and shrug, and let Ard keep his corridor anyway. I chose it because it was the only mechanism I had that put the outcome in the Dominion's own hands rather than ours, because a species that only ever proves its worth by winning fights it starts has proven nothing except that it can fight. I wanted them to have to look at their own law, built by their own architects, and either honor it or admit, in front of every world watching, that they never meant to. That was never really a bet on you or on Ilvex or even on me. It was a bet on them, I am glad more than I can easily say that it paid off. Finish the filing. You know how. Keep the office smelling like bad tea. It is, I have found, an excellent test of who actually wants to sit and talk rather than simply be seen talking. T.C. Priya read it twice, standing in the office doorway with the last of the afternoon light coming pale and autumnal through the window behind the desk. And then she folded it once, carefully, and set it in the top drawer where Kaur had always kept the paperwork that mattered too much to file away and forget. She did not cry, not then. That would come later, privately, in the particular unguarded hour before sleep when grief always seemed to find its way past whatever a person had built to hold it off during the day. But she sat down in the chair that had been his for 11 years and would now, unavoidably, be hers, and looked for a long moment at the empty desk, the placard through the window that now read ratified sovereign. The quiet office that no longer had anyone in it to teach her the next thing she didn't yet know she needed to learn. Then she reached for the kettle, because the tea in the consular office was, by long and deliberate tradition, terrible, and set it to boil, and began, because there was nothing else honest left to do with the rest of that afternoon, to finish the filing.